Contractors underquote construction projects when they don't understand costs. Everyone budgets for labor and machinery, but what about accruing annual leave or factoring in sick days and understanding how your indirect costs are driven by the schedule? So in this video, I'm going to explain the different categories of construction costs that you need to understand to estimate accurately and manage budgets properly. The costs we incur to deliver a construction project can be broken down into some very simple categories. We've got our direct costs, the costs of physically doing the construction work, which will be made up of labor, plant, material, and subcontract costs. We've then got our indirect costs, which are the costs of supervising, managing, and facilitating the works. These can be broken into recurring costs that are driven by the duration of the project and non-recurring one-off costs. Combine our direct and our indirect, we get our total project cost, to which we need to apply our margin, both our profit margin and our corporate overheads, plus factoring in the uncertainty that matters to our risk and opportunity to get our sell price, which is what we charge the client. So in the rest of this video, I'm going to talk about all these different categories of costs and what should be factored in and included in each of these buckets. But before I do this, I want to start with this idea of blurred lines. Different companies, different projects, different individuals have preferences for how to categorize these costs. So I'm going to talk about the general principles and what I think should be included in each bucket. But the reality is there are differing opinions and there are different ways to do this. For example, traffic management, you could cover that as an indirect cost because it's not directly related to a specific construction activity, or you could include it in your direct cost budget. Subcontractor labor hire, you could call a subcontract cost or you could call a labor cost. A site supervisor might be categorized as a direct cost, might be categorized as an indirect cost. Different companies deal with upfront equipment purchases differently. They might charge the whole lot to the project, or they might choose to accrue it. Or temporary works, for example, might be included in the activity cost or the indirect cost. Now, there is no right, there is no wrong answer. The goal of categorizing costs and having these buckets is to come up with a comprehensive way to include accurately all the costs we incur to deliver the project, because missed costs equal missed margin. So going through this video, the goal is to understand these buckets and understand all the costs we are going to incur so you can estimate for them and track them properly. The goal isn't to memorize these categories perfectly because a lot of it comes down to opinion and project specifics. Okay, so the first bucket we're going to look at are our direct costs. Direct costs are the costs of physically completing the construction work. For example, if we're doing concreting, it's the cost of the concrete and steel reinforcement, the formwork labors, purchasing the formwork materials, and direct costs we can break down into labor, plant, materials, and subcontract costs. I like to think of direct costs as costs that directly contribute to the finished product the client's receiving. So the first of these buckets, we've got our labor costs. This is the site workforce that is physically completing the project. These costs include the base wages, superannuation, pension contributions, payroll tax, workers' compensation insurance, annual leave accruals, sick leave accruals, public holiday entitlements, long service leave, the upfront hiring and HR costs of finding people, and maybe any travel or accommodation costs related to the works. Now, I refer to these as on costs on top of their base wages. Some companies refer to it as the labor burden. And the point is you need to understand both the base wages and what labor burden or on costing you have. For example, you might have a carpenter that is receiving as their payment $45 an hour, but as a company, it's costing you $62 an hour once you factor in all these things. Now, our total labor cost is going to be a function of the hourly labor rate, the base wages, the on-costing and labor burden, the task productivity we've got, so the units of work per period of time, so how much work they're getting in how long they're doing the work for, the total quantity or volume of work. For example, 1,000 meters squared of formwork is going to cost more than 500 meters squared of formwork. And importantly, another very important thing to consider when you're talking about labor costs is non-productive time. So you've got your productive time, which is when you're actually doing the work. Then you also need to pay people for pre-start in the morning, any toolbox you're doing, paid lunch or smoko breaks. And my philosophy with labor costs is you want to track here any costs that are proportional to the total hours worked. So I would include subcontractor labor hire. I would call that a labor cost because to me, while you're not factoring in the base wages and on costing, you're just paying a fixed cost per unit of time, it's still proportional to the total number of hours worked. Next, we've got our plant and equipment costs. Now, plant and equipment costs are machinery and tools that we hire or purchase to do the construction activity. So they can be both owned plant and equipment, and these can be hired plant and equipment. These things be like excavators, cranes, or concrete pumps when we're talking about plants, or hand tools and power tools when we're talking about equipment, scaffolding, site vehicles, so on and so forth. When we're talking about these rates, we want to get an all-encompassing total cost of using the plant and equipment. The same way when we spoke about labor, we spoke about payroll, tax, superannuation, public holidays, sick leave entitlements. When we're talking about plant and equipment, we need to factor in all the additional costs on top of the actual cost of hiring the plant. So this might be things like fuel and maintenance, floating the equipment in, floating it out, or if we own the equipment, any financing and capital costs. Now, in addition to that, if we are hiring plant or equipment through a subcontract, they might give us a wet hire rate, which means that the operator for the equipment is included in the rate for the plant. This is typical when we're talking about things like crane hire. The total cost of plant for a project is going to be a combination of the plant rate, so whether that's an owned rate that we've built up from deep depreciation and financing costs, or whether that is a daily or hourly hire rate plus any fuel and servicing. Then we've got any regular fixed costs, which might be servicing, floating the equipment in or out or whatever. Then same with labor, we've got our task productivity, which is going to be a function of units of work across time. Now, one thing with plant that you don't get as much with when you're estimating labor costs is that plant is often hired for a fixed duration, plant and equipment. So you might only use scaffold for certain periods of time, but you are going to hire the scaffold at the start of the job and off hire it at the end of the job. So sometimes productivity isn't a good metric when talking about plant. You have to talk about fixed duration and do what's referred to as a plant balancing, where you can work out how much plant you need across the duration of the project and then smooth that out. And then as well, if we are talking about production rates, it is going to be a function of the total volume of work. Same with labor is we're going to have this non-productive time factor depending on how much the plant's actually used. This might also be, you can also have overutilization of plant where, for example, you're paying a daily rate for an excavator, but if you're also doing a day shift and night shift, you're actually not getting charged anything extra for the hire during the night shift, which would reduce the plant rate. So plant, more so than labor, you have to understand the utilization of the plant to price the works properly. So under plants, I would include any costs that are driven by the duration of the task or the duration of the project. So for example, I wouldn't include temporary works materials as plant and equipment. I would include those as a material cost because it's a one-off upfront purchase, but I do know some people like to include these things as plant and equipment. Next up, we've got our subcontract costs. So these are the costs of any specialist trades engaged to complete specific scope of work. So if we're a general contractor, the majority of our project direct costs are going to be made up of subcontractors. So you've got things like electrical, plumbing, HVAC, painting, civils, so on and so forth. We can engage these subcontractors under different contract models. So we might get a lump sum quote, so a quote to do the entire package of works. They're taking the risk for everything. We might get a schedule of rates quote. For example, we want someone to come in and do trenching, but we don't know the exact volume of trenching. So we want a rate per meter to be adjusted by the actual quantity. We can have cost reimbursable contracts where we're paying a subcontractor for the value of the work they've completed. So they'll charge us for the materials, the plant and equipment they're using, the labor. Now, as I said, if we're doing cost reimbursable works, I would include all these costs under the labor, plant, and materials buckets. I wouldn't think of them as a subcontract cost, or we can get them under wet hire. For example, hiring a crane with an operator, but again, I would consider that a plant cost, not a subcontract cost. When we're getting subcontract quotes, what we have to understand is that what we're asking them to do drives the cost. Sounds very simple, but people don't necessarily think of it that clearly. If we're asking people to do certain things, it's going to have a certain price tag associated with it. So when we're talking about subcontractor costs, the key thing to think about is the scope of work and the specific inclusions and exclusions. Now, the natural extension of this is if we change the work, we change the scope that someone's doing, they're going to hit us up with a bill, which is where we enter the world of variations, everyone's favorite topic in construction. But it's why it's such a big deal because, again, this is going to be a bit of a side, but construction, as we all know, is messy and complicated. So actually nailing down the specific inclusions and exclusions, which is what is driving the price of subcontracted works, is very, very difficult. And so it's why construction just inherently involves so much change and so many variations. So when we're talking about the total cost of subcontracted works, that's going to depend on the scope of works, what we're asking someone to price, the level of competition and number of quotes we get. If we're getting a specialist trade contractor, there's only one person who can do it in the entire market we're getting quotes for, we're going to end up getting a higher price. But if we can go to 20 subcontractors, I'm not saying you should get 20 such quotes, but in theory, something like concreting, where there's a lot of contractors that do it, will often get much better pricing if we introduce competition by getting more quotes. Then how well we define the scope, what variations we incur during construction, we also need to factor these in. Then any costs we incur to manage the works, while we wouldn't include them as a subcontract cost, we still need to think about and consider them in terms of the overall project costs. Now, again, when we're talking about cost reimbursable contracts or wet hire, I don't consider them subcontract costs. My rule of thumb for what is a subcontract cost is something where another company is taking risk on that item, meaning they're taking the responsibility to do the work and they're quoting to do it either through a lump sum contract or a schedule of rates contract. So the final bucket of costs we've got that I haven't included a lot of information for because they're actually relatively simple and straightforward, but they do form a huge portion of the project budget, is the physical materials that are going to be incorporated into work. So these are things like concrete, steel, formwork, fixtures, so on and so forth. Now, within materials, I also include any temporary materials that we purchase and consume in the project. So formwork, a temporary material, I would include here, but I wouldn't include scaffold because it's not something we're actually consuming through the works. When we consider material costs, we need to think about the delivery costs, the costs of getting those materials to site. Again, certain types of projects, the logistics of actually getting the materials to site, for example, a remote construction project in Australia, can be a huge portion of the overall project cost. We need to consider wastage allowances. So if we're factoring in 5 to 10% of the material being wasted for consumable items. And we also need to factor in storage, handling equipment, and also any completions requirements we have where we may have to hand over spare parts. Okay, so where are we up to? We've gone through our direct costs. So we've spoken about labor, plant, materials, and subcontract costs. And I also would like to more or less draw a distinction that these three items I would refer to as self-performing costs where we're managing the works ourselves. Subcontract costs when we're engaging another company to do them. However, together, we've come up with our direct costs, which are the cost of doing the physical construction works. Next, we're going to talk about indirect costs, which are the cost of supervising, managing, and facilitating the works. So, indirect costs are the cost to facilitate the works not attributable to a specific activity. One way you can think of them is that they're not part of the finished product the client is paying for. But again, if I go back to that example of traffic management I spoke about at the start, sometimes that doesn't really work because some people would consider traffic management a direct cost related to a specific task. But again, this goes back to the blurred lines. There is some overlap and confusion between direct and indirect costs. That's why you just have to understand all the different costs and categorize them in a way that best suits your projects. But typically when we're talking about indirect costs, we're talking about things like staff salaries, temporary offices, permits and approvals, a laydown area. These are costs that are going to be attributable to many different construction activities. So we've referred to them as an indirect cost. Now, I probably need to do a little more thinking and explanation of this, but another way I use the term direct and indirect costs, and I don't want to add confusion with this, but when you're preparing an estimate and submitting it to your client, I use the term direct cost as an item that we're going to show to our client in the pricing schedule that we're going to put a sell price against, and an indirect cost, something like insurances or inclement weather, which we don't want to show in our pricing schedule to the client. So we're not going to mark it up and produce a sell price. any money we put against these items, we're going to spread across all of our direct costs. Now, I do need to come up with better terms from that. That is another, and I don't want to add confusion, but that is another way of thinking about direct and indirect costs. Again, there's going to be tons of overlap, and it's project specific, comes down to personal preference between direct and indirect. And at the end of the day, it's not an important distinction as long as you understand that all the costs you're going to incur to deliver the works are budgeted for somewhere. Now, indirect costs, we've got two main categories. We've got non-recurring one-off costs like setting up our site facilities, paying for permits, paying for bank guarantees at the start of the project. Then we've got our recurring costs, which are driven by the duration of the project. That is why time is such a big driver of cost. Think about this. If you have a construction project and you need a full-time project manager, if it's a 6-month project or if it's a 12-month project or if it's an 18-month project, we're proportionately increasing the cost of project management. 6 months to a 12-month, we've doubled the cost that we need a project manager. We can apply that to hiring offices, toilets, staff salaries, all these things, and we can understand that the duration of the project is one of the key determinants of indirect costs. Okay, so where are we up to? We have built up our direct and indirect costs. What we need to now do is convert our total project costs into a sell price by adding on our risk and opportunity, allowing for the uncertainty that matters, our corporate overheads, and our profit margin. Okay, so the first of these is going to be our risk and opportunity. So an estimate is an estimate. When we're predicting how much a project's going to cost, we're taking all of our input information, rates, subcontractor pricing, productivity rates, our planned methodology, what we think is going to happen. We're putting all of that together, coming up with an idea of how much it's going to cost to deliver the project. But there are things we don't know, and there are things that are impossible to know at the outset of the project. We don't know how much it's going to rate. We don't know what those exact productivity rates are going to be, the exact ground conditions, if there's going to be design changes, or if our clients miss the whole lot of scope and going to give us a whole lot of profitable variations. Risk and opportunity is the process through which we allow for uncertainty in our price. Now, this doesn't necessarily just mean adding on contingency and contingency. Risk can also be positive, which is what we refer to as an opportunity. So if it's bad, we think of it as a threat. If it's got upside, it's an opportunity. We can allow for this uncertainty in our price generally two different ways. So we can just have broad project contingency, for example, marking up the entire cost by 2%, or we can do an activity-specific build-up where we look at every possible risk and opportunity and associate a probability and an impact against this. Now, the second method of doing a risk and opportunity build-up, what that isn't going to factor in is the unknowns and unknowns, the things we couldn't even possibly predict were going to happen. So we are always going to need some amount of percentage-based overall contingency. Whether we call that a risk and opportunity or whether that's factored into the profit margin we have on the project is another issue, but there is always going to need to be some allowance for unknown unknowns. Now, if we're going to do an activity-specific risk and opportunity register, we need to build up a complete build up a complete superset of what could possibly go wrong. Against that, we apply a probability of how uncertain that event is, the impact, what will happen if that occurs. Then we can get the value of that level of uncertainty, which is the probability multiplied by the impact. Then we need to come up with a mitigation, or when we're talking about an opportunity, some way to increase the likelihood or probability that it occurs. There will be some sort of mitigation cost, so the cost of implementing this mitigation, and then there will also be a post-mitigation probability and impact. So once we've done the mitigation, we've reduced the probability, reduced the impact, we'll have some sort of mitigated value. The next thing we need to factor in are corporate overhead. So in the same way, an indirect cost relates to a direct cost, not attributable to the specific activity. Our corporate overheads are business running costs that are non-specific to the project. So these are things like our head office rent and staff, our company vehicles, software costs, accounting and legal, insurances, IT systems, and probably the biggest one for construction companies is your marketing and business development, which is your cost of tendering new work. Now, the standard way of doing this is having a percentage across all of your projects. But again, some contractors will just bake this all into their profit margin. The way you work out what your corporate overheads markup should be is you need to have a forecast revenue amount. So say you're going to do $10 million of work this year, and your cost, your head office staff, all these things, tendering work is $1 million. Then basically you need to allow 10% on every project to recover that $1 million. Now, the final thing we need to include on our costs is our profit margin, which is the bit we care about. That's what's left over for the owners of the business after all these costs have been paid. With our profit margin, you can either reinvest this, so you can buy better equipment, grow the business, hire more staff, do things like that, or it can be redistributed to the owners of the business. Profit margins are a function of our project risk. So generally, if we're doing a riskier project, and that's when I was mentioning before about how you include contingency, is that the general approach is the more risk you're taking on as a contractor, you should be rewarded with a higher profit margin. If you're doing a cost reimbursable project where you're taking on zero risk, you're probably happy to do it for a lower profit margin. If you're taking on some huge EPC challenging project that there's a real risk of things going wrong, you probably want to be compensated with a higher profit margin. Top of that, the other factor that's going to influence profit margin is the market competition. So how many other contractors are out there who can do the exact same work that you're going to be competing against? If there's not many, you can charge a higher price. If there's a lot, you've got to charge a lower price. And then also the relationship you've got with your client. If your client loves you and wants you to do the work, they're probably happy to pay a slight premium to work with you. If you have no relationship with the client, they just see you as contractor A, B, or C, then you obviously don't have the opportunity to increase your profit margin because you're going to be winning the project based on price. So basically that is how we went. So I'll just scroll back up to the top quickly. That is how we went from our direct costs, our labor, plant, materials, and subcontract, our indirect costs, our recurring and non-recurring, non-activity specific costs together with our total costs. We've applied our margin and risk and opportunity, and we have a price to bill the client. So those are the categories of costs. Again, this wasn't an estimating video of how you calculate these costs. This was purely talking about what these buckets are so you properly understand them. Now, I want to show you some broad industry-based figures so you can understand which of these costs actually matter. Now, I saw these numbers, I did some research to find them. I'm a tiny bit skeptical about some of them because the numbers I've seen on projects tend to be quite different, but I guess these are probably more broad general industry numbers, and I've tended to work on larger projects. So I've seen often overheads have been much higher than what you're seeing on these, and profit margins tend to be a little higher. But these are typical breakdowns of project costs. Instantly, what stands out to me, and I think what is relatively obvious, the bulk of your costs are labor and materials. Equipment, not a huge cost. Overheads, these I thought were a bit smaller. I'm used to seeing overheads as a higher proportion of the overall project cost. But when you're thinking about the cost to drive a construction project, and I guess everyone probably knew this intuitively, purchasing materials and the labor, they are the big drivers of cost and what you really need to understand. So as I said in the beginning, this wasn't a video about the estimating process. This was a video about construction costs and understanding all the different categories of costs and how they fit together. Again, it's not meant to be prescriptive, saying exactly where each item of cost goes. It's meant to be comprehensive. Because at the end of the day, if you miss factoring in any of these items into your estimate, or you're not tracking and controlling them properly, missed costs equal missed margin.